Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Sejam bem-vindos à Conferência Anual do Banco Central do Brasil 2026. Tem por objetivo estimular o debate e a pesquisa nas áreas da macroeconomia, sustentabilidade, estabilidade financeira, economia bancária, intermediação e inovação financeira, regulação macroprudencial, economia internacional e finanças. Nesses 3 dias, contaremos com apresentações feitas por acadêmicos, especialistas do setor privado e representantes de bancos centrais e entidades, instituições multilaterais. Ao longo da semana, teremos palestras magnas e uma sessão especial. Serão transmitidas para o canal do Banco Central do Brasil no YouTube. Sessões paralelas de apresentações e debates serão gravadas para posterior divulgação na página do evento, no site do Banco Central do Brasil. A programação completa do evento pode ser encontrada no site do Banco Central ou consultada por meio do QR Code disponível em seus crachás. Neste ano, o Banco Central do Brasil conta com a parceria do Fundo Garantidor de Créditos, FGC, para a organização da conferência. Temos também o apoio das seguintes instituições: Associação Brasileira de Instituições de Pagamento, ABPAG, Associação Brasileira das Entidades dos Mercados Financeiro e de Capitais, Ambima, e Zeta, Associação de Empresas de Tecnologia com atuação no setor financeiro e de meios de pagamento. Colabora para a realização do evento a Federação Brasileira de Bancos, FEBRABAN, e contamos ainda com a cooperação da Associação Brasileira de Bancos, ABBC. Para proferir o discurso de abertura, convidamos o senhor Gabriel Galípolo, presidente do Banco Central do Brasil.
Bom dia a todos. Eu vou tomar o cuidado de deixar um celular aqui na frente para eu ver o horário e não falar demais de novo, como eu costumo falar. Agradecer a presença de todos aqui hoje, em especial de todos os servidores do Banco Central que trabalharam aqui arduamente para conseguir realizar mais uma conferência anual do Banco Central, que é um evento que já está consagrado aqui como uma grande confluência dos diversos atores que estão pensando os diversos mandatos e atividades que envolvem o Banco Central. Então, queria começar agradecendo a todos os servidores do Banco Central. No nome do meu amigo Daniel Lima, aqui, agradecer a todos os parceiros. Ali está escrito FGC parceiro, não é só para esse evento, ali o FGC é parceiro, realmente parceiro em vários outros temas aqui. O FGC tem sido cada vez mais um grande parceiro aqui nosso. Então, agradecer em nome do Daniel todos os demais parceiros aqui que ajudaram, colaboraram para a realização desse evento. Como vocês sabem, a atividade de banqueiro central e a atividade de banco central é daquelas atividades de que, se você é apaixonado por economia, se você escolheu economia como ofício, independente de qual foi a sua formação acadêmica, ela vai demandar de você a reunir todas as faculdades necessárias para você desempenhá-la como nenhuma outra. Ela é bastante demandante, desafiante, mas ela vai te permitir exercer esse ofício que você escolheu como economista de maneira plena, como nenhum outro lugar vai te permitir. E é por isso que este evento aqui ele consegue concentrar e reunir essas diversas faculdades que demandam pessoas que são e convidam pessoas que estão aqui hoje, que são representantes e atuam fazendo política pública, seja dentro do Banco Central, de um Banco Central, seja em algum outro setor público ou de órgãos multilaterais, organismos internacionais, pesquisadores em universidades ou em centros de pesquisa. Então, eu quero fazer aqui esse agradecimento especial para todos que se dispuseram a vir aqui participar do evento, em especial para aqueles que vieram de longe. Eu sei o quão custoso é a gente se deslocar, se ausentar, poder vir até aqui para um evento como esse, mas sei também, recebendo vocês aqui agora, de o quão importante é a gente poder ter esse intercâmbio, tendo vocês aqui perto da gente e podendo ouvi-los, dialogar. Esse tipo de intercâmbio é que permite a gente conseguir avançar cada vez mais, reunir mais informações nesse nosso trabalho de está cada vez mais preparado para o que pode vir à frente. O Paulo brinca que eu uso muito metáforas náuticas, ainda que o velejador seja ele. Eu não sei velejar, mas eu estou simplesmente plagiando algo que a humanidade faz há muito tempo, né? Desde Sêneca, desde os gregos. Depois fui gradativamente tentando se atualizar com Kubrick, usando um pouquinho viagens para o espaço. Mas essa nossa atividade é uma atividade que a razão é uma condição necessária, mas não suficiente para a gente se preparar a priori para aquilo que pode vir, né? Essa metáfora de quem tem que desenhar um barco e reforçar esse seu barco, se preparar para as tempestades que podem chegar, sem nunca se desviar e esquecer do que é o seu destino, qual é o seu ponto de chegada, ela se aplica muito bem para o que é a atividade cotidiana de estar fazendo a atividade de banqueiro central, de banco central. E a gente está vivendo um período onde essas surpresas e intempéries de mudança do clima e do tempo têm ocorrido de uma concentração bastante grande, né? A gente está aqui passando pelo 4º choque de oferta em menos de 6 anos, né? Os choques de oferta colocam o Banco Central diante de um desafio que é bastante especial, né? Esse nosso barco, ele foi um barco que foi desenhado para enfrentar outro tipo de tempestade. Todos os instrumentos que nós temos são instrumentos que foram desenhados para enfrentar outro tipo de tempestade, mas, infelizmente, esse tipo de choque que a gente vem sofrendo afeta diretamente a percepção sobre aquilo que é o mandato central do Banco Central, né? Que é defender o custo de vida das pessoas, a moeda, a alta de preços. E isso tem demandado reunir ainda mais essas diversas faculdades para que a gente possa entender como enfrentar este problema. Um problema que coloca em xeque uma questão de credibilidade para todas as autoridades monetárias, mas não a credibilidade só aquela que nós estamos acostumados quando a gente está discutindo formação de expectativas e surveys que nós recebemos de especialistas. Mas hoje esse é um debate que chegou no cotidiano da vida das pessoas. A dissonância entre, muitas vezes, os números oficiais e o que é o sentimento das pessoas, pelo fato que os bancos centrais são desenhados para ter como objetivo uma meta de inflação e as pessoas convivem com um nível de preço, após 4 choques, isso vem produzindo uma dissonância que ela é bastante arriscada e coloca os bancos centrais numa situação especialmente difícil de como endereçar esses desafios. A gente tem a oportunidade aqui no Banco Central de estar dialogando com as maiores autoridades e os maiores pesquisadores sobre política monetária, e a gente tem assistido, inclusive, uma rejeição, não ia falar uma resistência, mas é uma rejeição a usar a expressão estagflação durante esse período. Curiosamente, o estag o pessoal está menos resistente, mas o tema de inflação o pessoal está um pouco mais resistente, justamente para sinalizar de que aquilo que a gente está passando agora se trata menos do que a gente entende como uma inflação tradicional, que é aquela pressão nos preços em função de uma elevação na demanda, mas algo que advém de outra natureza, né? Mas a gente simplesmente ter esse cuidado no trato da terminologia não endereça um problema central, que é como as pessoas estão percebendo a evolução de preços e como é que o Banco Central deve conseguir navegar por esse novo desafio que se coloca e, nisso, conseguir reunir tantas cabeças, pessoas que estão na fronteira da aplicação prática e da formulação dessas políticas, ela é absolutamente essencial. E no Brasil, em especial, talvez, eu falei que o Banco Central é um dos lugares onde você vai conseguir exercer na maior plenitude todas as faculdades que são necessárias, no Brasil em especial, né? O Brasil é um lugar que a gente costuma... Fui falar mal do Brasil, não está falando mal não, gente. Recebi já uma chamada aqui de algum lugar. Mas o Brasil costuma demandar um pouco a mais, né? A gente está aqui há 1 ano e meio, um pouco mais de 1 ano e meio na cadeira, já conseguiu reunir bastante desafio que a gente passou e experiência enfrentando uma série dessas questões. E neste momento, conseguir separar o que é efetivamente um processo de choque de oferta, seja por causa da questão do conflito geopolítico, seja porque a gente tem algum efeito climático, dos efeitos de segunda ordem que a gente precisa estar ainda mais vigilante do que estaria normalmente, né? Dado que a gente tem uma economia com expectativas desancoradas, dado que a gente tem um mercado de trabalho apertado, não é uma abordagem simples, mas o Banco Central, toda vez, e vai seguir dando, toda vez que foi colocado em desafio, vai seguir dando essa resposta, não vai se desviar daquilo que é o seu objetivo, que é o controle do processo inflacionário, e está sempre reforçando o seu barco para poder navegar nesses períodos de maior desafio e adversidade. Eu só quero encerrar falando tanto sobre política monetária. O ano 2026 é um ano que o Copom faz 30 anos, né, que a concepção do Copom fazem 30 anos. E na concepção e formulação do Copom a gente tem a maravilhosa figura do Chico Lopes, que nos deixou recentemente. Foram feitas várias matérias com depoimentos maravilhosos de amigos, pessoas que foram ministros da Fazenda, ex-presidentes de Banco Central. E o Chico, ao longo da vida dele, eu queria ter uma outra palavra mais leve para dizer, mas foi uma pessoa que sofreu uma série de injustiças na vida dele, né? Mas nós economistas, que temos uma ciência que nasce ali sobre a sombra da discussão do que é o tempo, como é que o tempo influencia o valor, né? Dialogando com as descobertas da física, e essa física que evoluiu para dizer que o tempo é uma coisa relativa, que talvez ele nem exista, seja só uma forma de percepção que o ser humano tem das coisas, mas o tempo é o melhor juiz que existe. Eu sou um sujeito que muitas vezes alguém fala para assim, você viu aquele livro novo, ou aquela música nova? Eu tenho uma tendência sempre a gostar mais dos clássicos, porque os clássicos são essas coisas que sobreviveram ao tempo, que passou o tempo, elas continuam ali, tendo algo para dizer para a gente, né? O Chico é um clássico. O Chico deixa a gente com essa certeza de que cada vez mais que o tempo passar, ele só vai ficar maior. A perspectiva do tempo não vai fazer ele diminuir no horizonte, ao contrário, só vai fazer ele aumentar no horizonte. E ele disse uma vez que ele tinha sido... o processo todo tinha acontecido porque ele tinha sido ingênuo de ter feito uma proposta técnica num ambiente que muitas vezes é conflagrado pela política. Pelo contrário, não haveria nada mais inteligente para fazer do que ter seguido com uma proposta técnica que, ainda que naquele momento possa não ter sido compreendida, que ainda naquele momento pode ter sido utilizada para qualquer questão que tenha desviado o que se pretendia fazer, o Chico segue sendo esse farol para nós de perseverança, de dedicação na sua contribuição, seja na academia, seja aqui no Banco Central, para aquilo que afeta tanto o nosso destino e a vida das pessoas comuns, que é a atuação de uma autoridade monetária do Banco Central. Então, queria aqui mandar um abraço para toda a família do Chico e dizer que essa casa e o país é eternamente grato a ele aqui. Então, muito obrigado a vocês e tenham todos um excelente evento. Obrigado.
Agradecemos as palavras do presidente Galípolo e, para darmos início à palestra magna do dia, convidamos para compor a mesa o senhor Paulo Piquete, diretor de Política Econômica, de Assuntos Internacionais e de Gestão de Riscos Corporativos do Banco Central do Brasil. O senhor Christopher Erceg, diretor adjunto do Departamento de Mercados Monetários e de Capitais do Fundo Monetário Internacional. Passamos a palavra ao diretor Paulo para moderar a sessão.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'll switch to English now. My job here is to introduce our keynote speaker, and I'll do that quickly because we have a full schedule until the end of the week, including ordinary sessions, other speeches, and this time the novelty of poster sessions as well during the intervals. So I'll just briefly mention that Professor Erceg got his PhD from the University of Chicago, worked at the Fed for some time, and currently he's a deputy director for monetary and capital markets department in the International Monetary Fund. And throughout his career, he has researched and published extensively at a high level on topics related to macroeconomics, including open macroeconomics, macroprudential, monetary policy, and several others. So if you heard Governor Galípolo's opening remarks, you see that we are now facing the fourth supply shock in a very short period of time. And in this regard, his talk couldn't be more timely because he will address this issue, but as always, on a very rigorous and analytical perspective. So I want to thank Professor Erceg for very kindly accepting our invitation, coming down here and providing us our speech. So, Professor Erceg, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So I want to begin by thanking the Central Bank of Brazil and Governor Galípolo and Deputy Governor Piketty for inviting me to speak to you at this really fantastic annual resource conference. I am really deeply honored to be here, and thank Paulo also for the very kind introduction. The usual disclaimer is going to apply, so these views are my own and not those of the International Monetary Fund. So few people really could have anticipated at the beginning of this decade some of the challenges that policymakers now confront. So this includes heightened geopolitical and economic fragmentation, but also the need to really skillfully navigate the sort of challenges that are associated with new technologies, radically new technologies that will affect how we make payments, that will really affect how we work and interact together. So it really is important to think about research in this sort of environment. And so in that vein, your work here in the research side really will be invaluable in helping central banks and other policy institutions navigate these transformative changes. So one major and consequential shift, following up on Governor Galípolo's talk, in the macro environment is the increasing prominence of supply shocks. And that'll be the focus of my lecture today. So it's really striking that the framework reviews conducted by major central banks at the beginning of this decade devoted very little attention to supply shocks. They were almost exclusively focused on the problems posed by very low interest rates and the effect of lower bound on policy rates. So it's all about how to stimulate demand. And now supply shocks are likely to essentially move into a much, much more prominent role, where their prominence is probably the highest that they've seen since the late 1970s. So, and rather than being confined to a particular sector, we see supply shocks as very broad-based. They are associated with big geopolitical shifts that have affected energy markets. A move away from open trade, as illustrated by the Baker, Bloom, and Davis Index. The restructuring of global supply chains and climate-induced food shocks. So there's really good reason to think that we may be entering an environment in which shocks are layered upon shocks, or what you might call a great immoderation. So the prospect of a shock-on-shock environment really raises questions both for policy transmission, for policy strategy, and indeed for the conduct of inflation targeting. So in terms of transmission, really a key issue is that most of the literature is focused very much on linear models, where you're looking at the effects of shocks in isolation. But the pandemic has really pointed us to thinking about the importance of nonlinearities in interactions between shocks. So in particular, can shocks transmit differently if inflation is running high before the shock, or output is running very strong, so you have a lot of resource pressures? So this has been an issue for a long time for central banks. If we go back to the experience of the 1970s, the OPEC shocks were preceded by big food shocks, and it's very likely that the interaction between them amplified the effects. But it's certainly very much in the focus of central banks today, where they have to think about dealing with big energy shocks and think about whether transmission could be affected by the developments around the inflation surge. So high inflation in the last few years, will that amplify the transmission of energy shocks? So an environment of proliferating shocks also matters a lot for policy strategy. So advanced economy central banks, at least, really have typically looked through transient supply shocks. And really the grounds for this were very intuitive. If they believed that the shock was transient, then it made little sense to react to it, because you really couldn't speed the return of inflation to target very much, and you just give a big hit to the real economy. Now, conversely, emerging markets took a very different tack, and they really thought it was important in the context of the inflation surge to respond very aggressively to these shocks in order to instill a strong credibility. But it really raises the questions of what are the lessons of the 2021 inflation surge? Is it that all central banks should essentially respond more aggressively to inflation? Or do we need a lot more nuance in that? We want to make sure that we avoid the opposite mistake of essentially causing needless recessions. Now, related issues on the merits of a gradualist approach. So if inflation rises persistently above target, what's the best way to bring it back down? Now, a gradualist approach has obvious appeal because essentially it cushions the blow to the real economy, but it can make the economy much more vulnerable to subsequent inflation shocks. And so you have to think about what are the risks associated with leaving inflation high and only bringing it down very slowly. So the risk management considerations are really paramount here. So this is an old question about how to navigate these trade-offs, a gradualist approach or a more forceful approach, but it has new relevance in our current environment. And then a more shock-prone environment can also have big implications for the conduct of inflation targeting. So I'll say at the onset that I think inflation targeting is very well suited for a more shock-prone environment. The framework has proved remarkably durable, and in particular, it's yielded impressive outcomes in controlling inflation in both advanced and emerging market economies. And this strong performance partly reflects a strong governance and transparency aspects of inflation targeting, which have improved policy effectiveness, but also really enhanced public accountability. And all this really helps shore up, support central bank independence. But there may be changes required at the margin. So in that vein, a key open question is whether a more shock-prone environment will really diminish the ability of central banks to practice flexible inflation targeting, meaning to put a very significant weight on the activity or employment component of their goals. It might be a secondary mandate for many central banks. In a very interesting recent paper, Claudio Borio has really traced the history of inflation targeting over several decades. And one key feature of his analysis was that you see a progressive shift towards more and more flexible inflation targeting. So central banks, as they gain credibility, were able to adjust policy to take account of these goals for activity and employment. But that might well change going forward. Credibility started out low in the 1990s, and it was really critical to make sure that central banks prioritized inflation control to build up that credibility. But good luck also helped. I mean, so this was an environment in which really central banks benefited from much smaller shocks and a lot of favorable developments, including essentially very favorable cost shocks associated with the big scaling up of imports from emerging market economies. Now, as IT matured, central banks could focus a lot more heavily on the employment component of their mandates, as Lars Svensson has argued. And this means that they could look at returning inflation to target over a somewhat longer horizon. And the main concern later then became weak demand and how to support weak demand, as I alluded to earlier. But moving forward, central banks really have to think about, they have a lot more credibility, but how do they maintain that credibility in an environment of much bigger shocks? So we could well see inflation deviate a lot more from target and more persistently from target. It could be under the sort of reaction functions that have been followed in the last couple of decades, something like an inflation forecast-based rule. It can be much more pronounced deviations of inflation from target and longer horizons to get back. And that potentially can undermine central bank credibility. So do we need changes in strategy in this sort of environment? So moving to my kind of the more grist of my presentation, these are a lot of high-level considerations that I'll try to address. And I'll devote most of my attention to using a structural modeling framework that is really aimed at better understanding some of the risks posed by supply shocks. It's based very much on work with my colleague at the fund, Jesper Linde, and Matthias Strapant of Goethe University. And I must say at the onset that I wouldn't really have been able to do this work without their invaluable contributions, both in terms of economic insights, but also really their amazing quantitative skills, because this was a major quantitative effort. So our model then is going to try to capture some of the features that we think are really relevant for accounting for the inflation surge in the United States and many other economies. I'll focus in the calibration of the model on the United States, but I think it really does have quite broader applicability. And this includes misperceptions about the persistence of shocks. So in our modeling framework, as I'll describe in more detail, agents can't tell if shocks are persistent or much more transient and have to essentially use Kalman filtering to make inferences. We'll have various forms of nonlinearities in the Phillips curve I'll describe more, but it'll include a form of regime shifting where essentially the intrinsic persistence of the economy shifts endogenously. And then after describing the model, and I'll discuss some extensions to open economies that include emerging market economies to think about how some of the supply shocks that we'll see in the closed economy model would play out in an open economy setting. So I think overall this framework should be very useful to central banks thinking about how to communicate about the sort of uncertainty posed by supply shocks, including through alternative scenarios in alt-sims, as well as hopefully refine policy advice in dealing with these sort of shocks. And so kind of specifically, I'll look at the implications of prescriptions such as looking through supply shocks. When does it make sense? When does it not? And finally, I'll discuss some possible implications for inflation targeting. So moving now to the details of our model, or some features of our model, maybe not all the details. then our model basically builds heavily on earlier work by Harding, Lindy, and Trabant. So they have a JME paper in 2023 that has a number of building block features. So it's a new Keynesian model, a GSG model, with sticky prices and wages, so the usual suspects on that score, but also habit persistence and consumption. And this helps the model account for empirically reasonable properties in response to, say, monetary shocks. You get a hump-shaped responsive output. But a key feature is that they have a Kimball aggregator on the preference side. And what that means is that relative to Dixit-Stiglitz, price and wage Phillips curves are going to be nonlinear. And in particular, it's going to really affect the transmission of both demand and cost push shocks. And so this is illustrated just by borrowing some results from their paper, where what we show here on the vertical axis is going to be inflation, the output gap, so resource pressure on the horizontal, with the left side meaning more resource pressure. And this blue mash of points right here is just derived from a stochastic simulation where we look at the effects of demand shocks, mainly monetary policy shocks, in the linearized version of the model. So not surprisingly, this is a straight line. If you have a cost shock against that environment, then it's just going to shift up the line relative to this median point. And it's not going to depend on resource slack or the level of inflation. It's just a one-off shift relative to the median. Now, it's very different in their environment with a nonlinear Phillips curve. And in particular, they dub it a banana shape because that's what it looks like at levels of, well, when the economy is in recession, the output gap is negative, you have a very flat Phillips curve. But when resource pressures are much higher, then you can see the Phillips curve really shifting up quite a bit right here. So really a much more upward slope in a hot economy. And that also has very important implications for cost shocks. And in particular, if you have this one-off cost shock, it shifts up the curve just a little bit at very low levels of resource pressure when you have a lot of slack in the economy, but much, much more. So you have a lot of pass-through in an economy that is much hotter. And this reflects strategic complementarities in price setting associated with this Kimball aggregator. Moreover, you get some very similar sort of effects with cost push shocks, depending on the level of inflation, that basically the pass-through is a lot higher in that case. Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Just if I move away from the, yeah, oh, no problem at all. Thanks. So in terms of what we do in the way of extra value added, our model is going to introduce 3 new features. First, we have Kalman learning about the persistence of the shocks. And here, as I mentioned, we have a framework where agents can't tell whether shocks are going to be persistent or transitory. And they've got to do Kalman filtering to make that assessment. And the motivation could be captured by the inflation surge experience. Here, we focus on the US, but it was broadly applicable for many other economies. The outer line right here is going to be US PCE inflation over the inflation surge period. What the purple segments are showing would be the forecasts of the survey of professional forecasts. So it's a median forecast. It's quarterly at an annualized rate. And you can see these nosediving back to 2%, even though inflation's going to the 5% range. So forecasters really thought that this is going to be a transient shock. And this is really a key aspect that we're really trying to capture in our model, is to account for this fact that inflation went up a lot, but forecasters really thought it was going to be transient for quite some time. We also allow for an inflation forecast-based Taylor rule with smoothing, and this plays a very important role in our analysis. Oftentimes the monetary rule is almost an afterthought, but here it's very critical. So inflation is going to respond to the expected path of inflation 4 quarters ahead. And this is consistent with really a voluminous literature on forward-looking Taylor rules. It really makes sense to think of inflation targeting as looking at a forecast of inflation. And so a Taylor rule makes quite a bit of sense in that context. The implications, though, are also very much aligned with policy during the inflation surge, where you can see looking at the 3-month forecast of the SPF participants, that the Fed was really expected to tighten minimally in early 2022, and really even in well into 2022. It was a pretty flat path for the policy rate. They ended up raising the policy rate to over 5%. So that plays an important role. And finally, we're going to allow for what I call endogenous price and wage indexation. This is the second really key nonlinearity in the model. And so you can think of the lag coefficient in the Phillips curve as capturing the degree of intrinsic persistence in the economy. And what we're going to do is make that lag coefficient, instead of being exogenous, as in many frameworks, then it's going to be endogenous. It's going to depend on the level of inflation and how much it deviates from baseline, as well as how persistently that occurs. And so if you have a very persistent deviation of inflation from baseline, then intrinsic persistence is going to increase. So what does that mean? It means that even small and transient shocks can have pretty persistent effects on inflation. And of course, more persistent shocks are going to have really big effects on inflation, as we'll see. So getting into some of the details of the model, the period utility functions can be assumed to be logarithmic. Consumption of individual agents is CT. We have habit, so that's why external consumption enters with a capital CT. And then there's disutility from working, and that's NT. The household budget constraint is just very familiar. Households consume. The nominal spending is PTCT. They buy nominal bonds. They make labor income. They earn income on their bond holdings. They pay lump sum taxes. They get profits. And finally, this HAT term is just a insurance payment or insurance payment or subsidy that allows consumption to be equalized across agents, because you have staggered wage setting. There's an unequal distribution of income. This means everybody gets the same consumption. Now, turning to firms, the setup is really familiar in most respects. So we have perfectly competitive firms. They bundle intermediate goods into a final good according to a Kimball aggregator. And so this is going to give rise to demand functions for the intermediate good, where the demand for any individual producer I relative to the aggregate is going to depend inversely on the price it charges relative to the aggregate. And then you have this psi p term, and that psi p term is going to give you the kink in the Phillips curve, the nonlinearity that I described earlier. Otherwise, the problem is really quite standard. Monopolistically competitive intermediate producers are going to maximize intertemporal profits, subject to a Calvo-style friction, as long as they get the ability to reoptimize their price. And those that don't, I'll describe their problem in a minute. That's going to give rise to the endogenous indexation feature. Now, I mentioned that agents have to learn about the underlying shocks. And so, here we have a cost push shock, AT, that's going to consist of an IID part, AT, and a persistent part, AP. And agents can observe the sum, but not the separate components. So this basically gives rise to a simple state space representation where agents are going to use the Kalman filter to do optimal forecasting. And that's how they predict both AT and AP. And a really key feature is going to be that the innovation variance of the transitory component is a lot bigger than that of the persistent component. What does that mean? It means that when they see a persistent shock, they're going to think it's transitory. So now the monetary policy rule, as I mentioned earlier, it's a forecast-based Taylor rule, where the policy rate is responding to the inflation forecast expectation of pi t plus 4, the output gap, and then there's smoothing. And we do consider variations where the central bank responds to inflation or to inflation 8 quarters ahead. So now we move to this endogenous price and wage indexation mechanism. And really, it starts out kind of familiar, because what's going to happen is that those firms that can't optimize set their price as a markup, pi t squiggle, over the price they charged last period, where pi t squiggle is going to be a weighted average of the inflation target, pi, and of last period's inflation, pi t minus 1 with a weight chi t in the latter. So that's just familiar from Cristiano, Eichenbaum, Evans. The difference here is that chi t is going to depend on a geometric weighted average pi t star of lagged inflation, pi t minus 1. So it's going to be a long distributed average of past inflation. So this is going to capture the idea that inflation goes up very persistently, then that indexation parameter is going to shift, and it really changes the structure of the economy. It really very markedly affects the Phillips curve. So you can see that visually by our calibrated indexation function right here, where we show the level of indexation. You can't really read that on the left axis. And on the vertical axis, it's going to show a geometric average of inflation. So if inflation is from 0 to 2%, the indexation parameter is set equal to 0. If inflation is at 3, it's still extremely low. We'll put 0.2, it essentially doesn't matter. But if inflation gets to 4 or 5%, then it really starts to affect the dynamics. Inflation indexation goes to 0.7 or 0.8. So that means that these transient shocks can have much more persistent effects. Now, I want to caution that indexation shouldn't be viewed as limited to formal indexation schemes. We're really interpreting it much more broadly as how inflation dynamics can shift in a higher inflation environment. And so I think it's very much in the spirit of some other work, including, for instance, a very nice paper by Claudio Emborio and colleagues at BIS on 2 inflation regimes, where they distinguish between inflation behavior in a low inflation environment where sector-specific shocks have very little influence on other sectors of the economy, where transmission of shocks to wages is very low. But in a hot economy where inflation is high, that transmission changes really quite markedly. And in particular, sector-specific shocks can have big spillovers to other sectors of the economy. And shocks that affect inflation can spill over a lot to wages. So workers become much more resistant to wage declines when they've already taken big hits. And so this is really what we're aiming to capture here. So to get a better sense of what it implies, what we show here is a geometric average of US past inflation going back to the early 60s. And my apology, this 0.02 is quarterly inflation. It has to be annualized, so we forgot to do that. So this is like essentially 8 to 10% inflation here. That geometric average is very high in the 70s and until the early 80s, and then it comes down a lot. And so those features are inherited by the indexation parameter, which is very low through the 60s till basically the late 60s, and then it starts to jump as inflation is high. And then indexation does come down a lot, first in the 80s and then precipitously in the 90s, and basically it stays at very low levels for the next 30 years. And this is consistent with a lot of evidence through the Great Moderation period of very low indexation. So that was almost an invariable property of empirical estimates, very low indexation. But you can see that this is particular to this environment. And in the more recent period, we've seen a big jump in indexation. It's come down significantly recently. So we won't spend much time on the calibration, just aside from saying that we have a very conventional calibration of the Taylor rule. So the smoothing coefficient is 0.85, the coefficient on expected inflation is 1.5, and it's 0.5 on the output gap when annualized. The other aspect, as I mentioned, is that the standard deviation of the transitory markup shock is a lot bigger than that of the persistent shock, and we'll see what that implies in just a moment. So now moving to the model. So in our paper, what we have is, and essentially I try to account for the inflation surge experience. And so we feed in shocks both to supply and demand that try to account as well as possible for the inflation surge, not just the behavior of inflation and activity in the policy rate, but also we really look at trying to fit those expectations that I showed you earlier. But many of the features can really be well summarized by just a one-off cost push shock that is persistent. So I'll focus on that here in my presentation. So what we'll focus on is this cost push shock with a persistence of 0.9, is an AR1, and agents are going to initially perceive it as a transient shock. So what we see looking at the left panel, this shows inflation. The outer envelope, the red lines, show the path of actual inflation implied by our model. And so it's very similar to the sort of hump-shaped response that I showed you in reality. Then you see these green lines right here. And what they are the forecasts of agents within the model. And so very similar to the data that we showed you earlier, at each date, they forecast that inflation is going to go back quite quickly. And it's only when they are continually surprised that they're updating their Kalman filtering and say, hey, maybe this is a more persistent shock. Now, in terms of the policy rate response, there's very little action in the policy rate in the first year. Why? Because the central bank also believes that the shock is going to be transient. And so the net effect is that you actually see that output expands. Why is that? Because in the very near term, the real interest rate falls. This is a pretty passive policy rate response. The real rate falls, output actually expands. So you get a cost push shock actually not only boosting inflation, but actually boosting output a little bit. And I think that this can help account for the resilience of many economies that we observed during the pandemic experience. Of course, demand shocks were also important. But moreover, it's also an interesting thing to contemplate when identifying structural VARs, because a key identifying restriction and sign restriction methods to identify structural VARs would be to assume that a cost push shock moves inflation and output in opposite directions. And so this would be an illustration of when that might not be applicable. But a really key thing here is this hump-shaped response. I'll spend a little bit more time on that. And it's really driven by a combination of inflation going up, and that means more indexation, and then the relatively passive response of policy. It's not an aggressive policy response, and that helps fuel this hump-shaped boom. So misperceptions then can have a lot worse consequences in a nonlinear modeling framework. And we'll start to look at the implications by looking at the implications in a linearized model of the same shock. So the same cost push shock with the same Kalman learning is going to give rise to this inflation response, where inflation just goes up a little bit above 3%, shown by the dashed purple line here. That's pretty easy to control. It doesn't pose a big challenge for monetary policy. Now, if you allow for the Kimball aggregator specification, so you have that form of nonlinearity, then you go to this red dashed line right here. And you see that the response is amplified quite a bit, but it really doesn't increase the persistence a lot. It comes back down pretty fast. It's only when you have these two forms of nonlinearity that you really get this big hump-shaped response. And this poses a much bigger policy challenge. So in terms of thinking about the policy challenges here, essentially what the policymaker can do is they're facing a much more vertical Phillips curve. So inflation goes up a lot faster if the economy is hot, or if you have big cost push shocks, but it's pretty easy to bring it down. You have a big kind of kappa in your Phillips curve equation, a big slope of the Phillips curve. And so you can just contract output a little bit and inflation comes right back down. So you just kind of ride back down a vertical Phillips curve. In contrast, in this case, once inflation's high right here, then you might have some latitude because the economy is overheating to bring down inflation. But still, even once you brought output to potential, you've got a big inflation problem. And so it really is going to mean that the trade-offs are much, much worse in this environment, as we'll see in a moment. Now, the nonlinearities are really going to matter under two conditions. One, if you're at the baseline, the shocks are big. The second is you start from poor initial conditions, so inflation's already above target, and then you have interactive effects, and then the shocks wouldn't have to be as big. And so we illustrate this in the first case, where you start from the baseline, right here, where I just repeat the last diagram, where inflation goes up to almost 7% here, in the linearized model about 3%. So that's with the same shock as I showed you a second ago. But if the shock is half as large, then the nonlinearities aren't nearly as big. And so that's shown in the lower left panel, where you see in the model with both nonlinearities, inflation only goes up to a little over 3%. And in the linearized model, there's not much of a gap. So given that US inflation really didn't average over a 30-some year period above 3%, then you might think that nonlinearities weren't particularly consequential during a lot of that period. And so during the Great Moderation period, it made sense to think about very little indexation and using forecast-based rules, and that these would be effective. But the question is, what happens when you move out of that period? When if the shocks really are a lot bigger? Weak initial conditions can work very similarly. So what we do here is consider allowing for shocks that boost output well above potential, as well as boost inflation above target. So, and then consider a cost push shock on top of that. So if we start from a baseline, the steady state, the cost push shock is going to push inflation 4.7% above its target level. So that's how the shock is scaled here. But if you look at the fourth line, for instance, the output gap is 4.1%, inflation 2.7, again induced by these prior shocks. And then the inflation response for the same cost push shock goes to over 8%. So you almost double the size of the shock against this backdrop. So this really is underscoring how nonlinearities can matter quite a bit through these interactive effects. So really a key issue is trying to assess with more precision when nonlinearities kick in and really materially alter transmission. So is it when you have 3% inflation and you get hit by an energy shock that it matters? Or do you have to go to 4 or 5% inflation for that to happen? And this really is going to depend a lot in our model on the calibration or estimation of the indexation function. And so what we've been working on is on estimating our model to try to pin down this indexation function to a higher degree. And one, of course, big challenge is that there have been very few episodes of high inflation in US history outside of the inflation surge, unless you go back to the period of the 1960s and 1970s. So that's essentially exactly what we've done, is go way back to the early 60s to try to come up with more refined estimates of the indexation function, as well as the underlying shocks. So at this point, we've partially estimated the model, meaning that we've fit the model to data on activity, so output, on inflation and the policy rates. And we've used a number of structural shocks to do that. So we have the cost push shock in the model. We have a demand shock, which is just a discount factor shock in this simple specification. And finally, shocks to the policy reaction function. And we've matched we've estimated the properties of the underlying shock processes, as well as backed out estimates of each of these components. And so that's what I'll illustrate next. I think this is still work in progress. It's very much hot off the press. A couple of features really appear to be coming across in a very robust way. And one is that both types of nonlinearities seem to matter during periods of large cost shocks. So that the two nonlinearities I mentioned are both very consequential, and you need the endogenous indexation in addition to the Kimball aggregator. And then there's a point about nonlinearities mattering overall. And so what I show here is that we've got the nonlinear model with all the shocks shown by the solid line right here. The same shocks in the linearized model trace out this specification here. And the gap between them is going to tell you about the role of nonlinearities in explaining the data. And so you see a big role for nonlinearities starting to kick in the early 1970s, even before OPEC. You had big food shocks. And then even stronger through the late 70s. Again, in the more recent period, you see a pretty significant role for nonlinearities. So that's nonlinearities, but then the period between 1990 and 2020, very little in the way of nonlinearities. The one exception in that period is right here in 2009, where the linear model is going to predict a big drop in inflation. So if you have a linear Phillips curve, big drop. The nonlinear model, because of that banana shape, is going to assuage that drop. And so it actually fits the data a whole lot better. A second feature that really comes through is in the decompositions of the different responses, including of PCE inflation is shown here. And so what we're going to do is decompose the shocks into three components: a cost push shock, a discount factor shock, and a monetary policy shock. And you can see that this bluish line right here suggests that cost push shocks played a really big role in the inflation run-up in the 70s, and also in the more recent inflation surge period. Now, interestingly, negative cost shocks actually played an important role in restraining inflation in the Great Moderation period. So you see that here. So overall, the message is that shocks are very consequential. There's also some suggestion of important interactions between shocks. And you can see that, for instance, in the recent period where stimulative monetary shocks interacted with the cost push shocks in driving up inflation. So I'll now discuss some implications for policy strategy. So I'll first simply assert, we have the results in the paper, that inflation forecast targeting is applied to transient shocks when you're near the steady state works really quite well. So it doesn't make sense to react aggressively to a transient supply shock when inflation expectations are well anchored and the shock is in fact transient. But what really gives rise to the problems then, as I mentioned, is when you have more persistent shocks. And so this right here is going to repeat the figure shown previously where inflation goes to like 7% and output expands. And in this sort of environment, it can make a lot of sense to respond more aggressively. And so if you think of a rule that would put significant weight on responding to realized inflation, that's shown by the pink line here. And it really reduces that hump shape in inflation. There's practically no hump. Now, there is some modest cost to output that's going to depend on how quickly you shift gears and react. But here it's really quite modest. And if you in fact do a simple calculation approximating welfare using a simple quadratic loss function with equal weights on inflation and the output gap, there are major benefits to reacting more aggressively along the lines of the pink line in that environment. So this logic is going to come out even more forcefully in the context of stochastic sims. And here what we do is consider how central banks facing a hot economy where inflation's gone up almost to double digits here, what sort of challenges they face if there are additional shocks on top of that. So you can think of this as really highlighting upside inflation risks on top of an alternative scenario. And it's probably a little hard to see here, but what we've done is basically match this distribution of shocks over the same period that I described earlier, starting in the 60s. And you see this really huge upward skew in the distribution of inflation. It shows how a gradualist approach would bring down inflation, but it leaves the economy very vulnerable. Now, of course, the benefit of gradualism is that there's very little hit to output. It looks like a worse hit than actually is the case, because what's happening here is basically the demand shocks that drive up the inflation initially are wearing off. But there's very little hit to output. So the benefits of gradualism would seem to be, well, we don't hit output a lot, but it leaves you very, very vulnerable to these additional shocks. Now, you could consider a more aggressive policy reaction function that really brings down inflation much more quickly, as you'd expect, as well as narrowing the distribution of inflation outcomes. Now, if you do it belatedly, as here, because you're not doing it until inflation's at a peak, then it really could take a big hit to output. So the overall message here is that it really can be desirable to use a forecast-based rule when you're near the steady state, but a more aggressive response against inflation can be desirable in response to large shocks or when the economy is overheating. So we've also worked to basically incorporate these same mechanisms into an open economy model. We call it the Quantitative Integrated Policy Framework model. It's been developed by our MCM department. And it's an open economy DSG model that has been applied to many both advanced and emerging market economies. And the model is really useful in assessing the effects of a wide range of shocks to energy prices, to trade policy, to the currency risk premium. And many of the sort of implications that I've traced out, both in terms of transmission and policy implications, continue to apply in this sort of setting. And so, for example, we might think that currency risk premium shocks could become a lot more volatile in an environment of greater policy uncertainty. And we've shown that in the recent IMF, or actually pretty recent IMF GFSR in last fall, where if you have greater economic policy uncertainty or the VIX is higher, it tends to amplify exchange rate volatility. Now, these sort of shocks can have pretty modest effects near the steady state. So a shock to the UIP premium that drives up depreciates the currency by 10%, might have pretty modest effects on inflation, including in small open economies and in open emerging market economies in normal times, and be moderately stimulative for output. But that can change a lot against the backdrop of an economy where inflation is already well above target. And in fact, there's a nice paper by Riksbank staff illustrating, in Sweden's case, how you have this very state-dependent transmission of currency risk premium shocks. But this framework, I think, is very useful for really developing alternative scenarios that aren't just focused on shock uncertainty. So what happens if the currency risk premium moves the exchange rate by 10% or oil prices go up by 50%, but rather on transmission uncertainty. And so that's what I'll illustrate next in the context of an energy shock. So here we're going to think about state-dependent transmission of energy shocks using the QIPF model. And this is basically calibrated in a very similar way to what I described earlier for the US economy, but we've considered many extensions, including to small open economies and emerging markets. So here we have a 50% energy shock under different initial conditions. And if you're starting out near the steady state, so inflation's near target in the US case of 2%, then the 50% energy shock moves up inflation by something like 0.4, 0.5% on average during the first year, and a little bit more thereafter. But if you're against the backdrop of an economy where the inflation rate is running closer to 5%, say 4.5 or 5%, then you see really considerably amplified transmission, where the effects on core are closer to 0.7. So they're not quite double, but they're getting in that vicinity. So much bigger effects on core. Now, if you think about the case of an emerging market where FX markets are not very deep, then if they're an oil importer, you get kind of a double whammy from a depreciation in the exchange rate when energy prices go up. And if the foreign exchange market is not very deep, that can have a lot of transmission to the exchange rate and in turn to inflation. So there you could even get bigger effects. But really the key point here is to think about when do these nonlinearities really become material. And so that's why what we're trying to do is develop a framework where we can think a lot more about transmission uncertainty and bound that uncertainty in a reasonable way. Because we don't want to just make assumptions about amplified transmission that aren't rooted in data. So the estimation of the indexation function and other aspects of the model should help bound this sort of uncertainty. So now I'll turn to thinking kind of more generally about implications for inflation targeting. And I think in that context, it's very helpful to think about the Taylor curve. So John Taylor made some really great contributions, one of which was the Taylor curve. And so what, just as a refresher, we have here is thinking about how the unconditional opportunity set of policymakers is going to shift in a more volatile shock environment. And this is just a purely illustrative sort of calibration here. But you can just imagine that you have, this should actually be the standard deviation of inflation on the vertical axis, the standard deviation of the output gap on the horizontal axis. And if you think of a point A right here, this will be associated with a particular calibration of the Taylor rule, say a particular coefficient on inflation. Or if you're thinking about a full commitment optimal policy, a lambda weighting inflation versus the output gap that would put a relatively high weight on the output gap here. And as you move down along this curve, what's going to happen is, well, I'm sorry, I should have said if the policymaker reacts more to inflation, then you're going to move down along this curve. So the volatility of inflation is going to be compressed and the volatility of output gap is going to expand. Now, if you have a shift because of more volatile supply shocks, that's going to shift your curve out to here, so move out there. If you keep the same reaction function, then you're going to move up to a point like B, where you have considerably more volatile inflation. And that poses a big challenge for central banks that are inflation targeters, because it means that on average, inflation is going to be further away from target. So you can imagine that it can make sense to essentially respond more forcefully and move back to this sort of point. But it takes a shift in the reaction function. Now, more difficult trade-offs can arise if you're in a situation where the policymaker's opportunity set depends on the policymaker's choices. And so that's what we're actually considering here. And so I'm very grateful to my colleague, Marcin Kolasa, who's done a lot of work on the QIPF model to help set up these simulations. And what we're trying to do is characterize essentially conditional Taylor curves. So these are Taylor curves that would be conditional on underlying shocks. And so particularly we start with a standard Taylor curve in the QIPF model derived in a very similar way. So you could take a point A as your initial point where the policymaker put some weight, say 1.5 on inflation, and then bigger weights would yield inflation and output gap outcomes along here. And then if you consider a bad realization of shocks, now what can happen is if you stuck with the same rule, sorry, I did not move that appropriately, sorry. If you consider the same rule right here with this bad realization of shocks, then you could be up at this point with very poor trade-offs where inflation is very persistently high. It'll be consistent with the specification that I showed you earlier showing the impulse responses, but I think it's very helpful to think of it in terms of how it affects the opportunity set. Now, if you then decide to react more, you've got really poor trade-offs. It's not just moving back down the nonlinear Phillips curve. It really takes a very big hit to output to try to get you back. So the underlying message is that it really may be helpful in a more shock-prone environment to react more forcefully, especially to bigger shocks or in circumstances where inflation has been running high and you have these big interaction effects. So with that, I'll wrap up. So in my lecture, I've focused on the implications of a more shock-prone environment in which supply shocks are larger and more pervasive than before the pandemic. So I've proposed really a number of tractable features on the structural modeling side to help capture how these developments may affect transmission. And I've paid really particular attention to Phillips curve nonlinearities and how they may create interactions with shocks that can pose major risks to price stability. My hope is that modifications along these lines will be very useful in helping central banks enhance their analysis of risk to the outlook, including through stochastic scenarios and alternative, through alternative scenarios in stochastic sims. But rather than focus mainly on risks to exogenous shocks, I really emphasize the importance of thinking more about a transmission uncertainty in alternative scenarios and how to bound that uncertainty, how it is affected by monetary policy choices. So this is very relevant today as central banks must decide how to respond to energy shocks. And it'll also be important going forward if we really are facing a great moderation environment. Of course, more research is needed to better understand the sort of thresholds at which these nonlinearities become material. We haven't had that much experience with it in advanced economies, but it is important to draw on evidence from earlier periods as well as cross-country evidence. So on the policy side, my analysis really suggests more caution in looking through supply shocks under some conditions. When inflation is high or the economy is hot, but at the same time, it may make a lot of sense to essentially do so when you're a lot closer to steady state and shocks really are moderate in size and with high probability likely to be transient. So from a broader perspective, the more volatile supply shock environment may require some changes in the implementation of inflation targeting, likely calling for a more aggressive reaction function to inflation under certain circumstances to maintain policy credibility. Of course, better characterizing when the risks become sizable and how they depend on country circumstances remains really a key task for ongoing research, and was one of the reasons why the research is needed to support good policymaking. And I think it really underscores the value of the work here, where I really look forward to the next several days of presentations where we'll explore these issues in much greater detail. Well, thanks very much.
Is it on? No? Can I borrow your mic?
Oh, please, yeah.
Não? Não tem botão. Thanks a lot, Christopher. And you kept your end of the bargain with the time, but we started a little late. So in the benefit of time, I'm sure everybody must have lots of questions, but we can perhaps take a batch of 3 questions, and then you will be around for the rest of the week. So let's take 3 questions and go from that. Fernanda, please. Tem microfone para aqui na frente, por favor.
Thank you, Christopher. That was a very interesting model, and I think it's going to be very useful to a number of central banks going forward. But my question is, if you were a central bank, and if you agree with the scenario of more frequent shocks, and you are not certain on the extension of shocks, like the one you have embedded in your model, on top of the policy strategy things you kind of penciled out here, should maybe you add another one that when facing the uncertainty on the extent and size of the shock, should central banks always react in a more aggressive manner?
Should we take a couple? Any other questions?
Thanks for the presentation, Chris. The way I think about your sort of endogenous persistence is maybe as a shortcut for expectation regimes that shift between anchored and unanchored, right? So you have, if I understand correctly, rational expectations with the filtering problem, but maybe that's a shortcut for trying to think about times when expectations are anchored and re-anchored. Have you guys thought about that, and how much weight do you put in the actual survey expectations that you observe as maybe a way to detect these unanchoring regimes? Thank you.
Make a very quick one. It's not an easy answer. You can answer with yes or no, and then we can talk later. But you mentioned luck is part of what happened, including the US. And do you see in your model a space for a negative cost push shock coming from AI-related productivity gains in the horizon of monetary policy?
Oh, thanks. So very good questions. I think in terms of whether you'd always want to react more aggressively to a cost push shock, I think that the answer would be no. I think if you're relatively close to the steady state, inflation's at your target, the economy is not running hot, then a shock, whether it's an energy shock or other form of supply shock, even if it might be quite a bit more persistent, you essentially try to calibrate bounds for how big the effects can be. So using the energy shock example here, you might say, well, if it's a transient shock, then the effects on core inflation, the 50% shock instead of being 0.4 might only be 0.2. But if it's persistent and dies out with a half-life of, say, 9 months or thereabouts, then the core inflation response might be more like 0.4, and that's actually the assumption underlying this. But you put reasonable bounds on it, and so it wouldn't necessarily mean that you have to react a lot more aggressively. I think that you, especially initially, you could take some time to learn about really how big and pervasive the shock is going to be before you really react to it, including through your communication. So that's one point. I think in terms of the regime switching, I think that is a correct interpretation of what we have in mind, that we really have the heart of our model, the goal of trying to capture how in higher inflation environments, you really have fundamental changes in expectations about how shocks will play through. It is a rational expectations model, of course. And so what that means is that as agents see endogenous persistence increasing, they're going to recognize that shocks, even transient shocks, are going to have a lot bigger effects. So they internalize that. And so you'd see much more sensitivity of expectations to those shocks. And so it captures all those features, albeit, I admit, in a somewhat reduced form way. I think I'll use that as a platform for saying there are additional sorts of uncertainty that we would probably want to incorporate in other analysis. So here we've got a framework where the monetary policy reaction function is completely understood. There's really no uncertainty about the long run target of the central bank. But you can imagine in circumstances where inflation is running high, the outcomes could look even worse than what we've shown here if you didn't have such long run anchoring. Because it could be the case, for instance, that if you allow inflation to run persistently high and then react more passively than markets expect to that, markets are going to interpret that as a lack of commitment to your long-term inflation target. And so long-term inflation expectations can rise in that environment. So I wrote a paper with Andy Levin many years ago on exactly this, and it could easily be embedded into this sort of framework, for instance. We also don't have features that I think would be relevant for thinking about risks of fiscal dominance and risks of financial dominance. Frank Schmetz had a very nice talk last year in which he discussed this in much more detail, the former of those. And so finally, to your question about the possibility for AI to exert negative effects on inflation, certainly it's quite possible that we see that. And if we go back to the US experience in the 2003 to 2006 period, then supply shocks really did exert a significant negative effect on the economy. It was an environment where growth accelerated enormously. It went from like 2.5% to 4.5%. But inflation was very tepid. And so the Fed was really struggling with very low inflation in the early part of that period, and it restrained their willingness to raise interest rates. But it really depends a lot on the relative strength of supply versus demand effects. Their supply dominated. The demand effects were not very big. In the period in the late 90s, conversely, the demand effects were a lot bigger. And so the downward pressure on inflation, not very much. And so if you think of the current environment, it really is, to me, an open question, which wins. So you have demand side effects coming from increases in equity valuations that spill around all over the world in declines in risk premium. You have demand side effects that are positive because you have data centers that are being built all over, and that creates demand pressures. And so those could be enough to offset the deflationary impact. I think it's an open question to me, but very good one.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. We did start our conference on a very high note. Thank you for that. And I'll ask everybody to join me in a last warm round of applause for our guest.
Agradecemos ao Sr. Paulo Piketty e ao Sr. Christopher Erceg pela apresentação. Thank you very much, Mr. Christopher. Faremos agora um breve intervalo de 20 minutos.
Teste e som.
Thank you for being here. Okay, let me pass it. Thank you.
Bem-vindos de volta à quarta edição da Conferência Anual do Banco Central do Brasil. Nossa próxima sessão abordará experiências com a implantação e operação de um buffer contracíclico neutro positivo de diferentes instituições estrangeiras. Para moderar a sessão, a senhora Fernanda Bandeira, ao centro da mesa, auditora do Departamento de Regulação Prudencial e Cambial do Banco Central do Brasil. Fazendo parte da mesa, igualmente, o senhor Ángel Estrada, consultor sênior do governador do Banco de Espanha. O senhor Graham McGrath, chefe da divisão de teste de estresse bancário e resiliência do Bank of England. O senhor Jon Thor Sturluson, economista-chefe da Finansinspektionen, supervisor do sistema financeiro sueco. E a senhora Mara Pirovano, líder de estabilidade financeira da divisão de política macroprudencial do Banco Central Europeu. Fernanda, a palavra é sua.
Obrigada. Now, thank you all. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today is a great pleasure for me to welcome our distinguished panelists here today. But before, I want to thank the organizers for this special space here to discuss this very interesting subject for me. And also to the highly qualified audience we'll have today. My objective here is to have the opportunity to encourage further research on the topic we'll be discussing today. It's a more policy-oriented debate here, but we expect that further research can be developed in this area. So, just starting, I have just a few words about the CCYB. You may be aware the counter-cyclical capital buffer was one of the key responses back in 2010 to the global financial crisis. It was part of the Basel III Accord. In Brazil, we introduced the standard in 2015, and today its rate is set on a quarterly basis by the Começo, the Financial Stability Committee here at the Central Bank. The CCYB design was supposed to, it is designed, the capital buffer is designed to accumulate, be accumulated, be activated or increased as you wish, as cyclical risks increase, build up over the cycle, and to be released when in times of stress. Back then, in 2010, in its original design, absent those risks, absent signs of imbalance, the rate should remain at the 0%, which is the lower bound of the range of possible values for the CCYB. And we refer to that base rate as the neutral rate. In Brazil, it is zero. And more recently, the international experience has strengthened the case for a more proactive, to start accumulating this releasable capital. You will see us regulators calling the CCYB as the releasable portion of capital, the releasable capital, the cycle-adjusted capital, so on and so forth. And there was this case to start accumulating this parcel before, in normal times. And the idea is that if you have releasable capital available, when you release and this policy proved to be effective in helping banks absorb shocks and also sustain the credit flow. So, but as I mentioned before, the original design implies base rate of 0, and there is it introduces a kind of inertia that we will discuss here, and for several reasons. And because of this, there is this discussion of moving towards a more proactive approach and to having positive neutral rates in our framework. So I will move to invite Mara. Mara, she has an extensive experience, a deep understanding of different designs, different types of calibration and implementation challenges in the CCYB at the European level. So Mara, over to you. Thank you.
Well, good morning to everyone, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this panel today. I don't see the slides on the screen, but just to start, well, I mean, my name is Mara Pirovano. I work at the European Central Bank, and it will be a pleasure today to talk to you about the challenges of a positive neutral CCYB, bringing out the European perspective. The usual disclaimer applies, is my own views and do not necessarily reflect those of the ECB or the Euro system. Well, I can just quickly start before the slide come up. So just well, to start again with what is a positive neutral CCYB actually. This was actually one of the main challenges we encountered when starting approaching this topic. And well, what it is not is actually a structural use of a buffer that was designed to be counter-cyclical. But rather what it is the early activation of this counter-cyclical buffer in an environment where cyclical systemic risks are neither subdued nor elevated. So what is called like a standard risk environment. Well, at ECB, we have strongly supported these early activation approaches, and indeed to avoid a bit at the confusion with the semi-structural use, we have shifted towards naming it as early activation rather than positive neutral, which gives indeed a bit more of a structural delineation to this buffer. So we have conducted extensive work on this topic. On the slide that I was supposed to show you, there are several links to publications, both more policy-related and academic publications, which, if you're interested, well, you may have a look. But most importantly, together with the European Systemic Risk Board, we have launched a work stream back in 2024 that has included more than 20 members from national authorities in the European Economic Area. And this work stream has produced a joint report, which was published in January 25, and on which the insights I will present to you are based. Now for the next slide, I would really need a visual because it's a visual slide. So I'm not sure how to... Sorry about that. So, well, the slide is about well, try to improvise a bit here. It's about the current implementation of the positive neutral CCYB in the fantastic, thank you, in the European Economic Area. No, that was actually this one. So, at the moment we have 18 countries that have adopted such early activation CCYB approach. And actually, already from this slide, you can spot some of the challenges I will delve deeper into later. So first of all, you see that some countries have a little red dot there, and these red dots are the target positive neutral rate they have announced, while some other countries don't have those little dots. Another feature you see is the heterogeneity in the rates that are applied across countries. So the rate nowadays from 2% target rate to a 0.5 target rate. So, well, one of the main challenges in Europe is indeed the heterogeneity. So the 13 countries that have introduced an explicit target rate did so because they considered an explicit target to ensure predictability of the rate, transparency vis-à-vis the banking sector, and clarity of communication. Other 5 countries instead opted for an early activation approach without an explicit target rate to remain a bit more flexible, and they didn't really see a need to have an explicit target. And well, the heterogeneous calibrations come not only from a policy preferences across countries, but also from the different calibration methods for these target positive neutral rates that have been used. And well, in this table, you see that quite a variety of methods have been implemented by national authorities. However, despite most authorities rely on some modeling framework, ultimately expert judgment still plays a key role. There is also some heterogeneity regarding the objectives for adopting such early activation approaches, which, well, sometimes actually they coexist. And the main motivations regard timing and amount. So on the timing side, authorities mentioned that this approach is very useful to ensure the early activation of the CCYB, a timely activation due to, for example, data lags that may delay the identification of risks that will then result in an activation of the buffer, and also a more gradual buildup of the buffer. So the earlier you start, then the more gradually you can build it up, and then can have more limited consequences on the banking sector. And regarding the amount, well, the motivations are mostly, well, ensuring a greater availability of buffers that can be released in the event of a shock, and that was a big lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic, and increasing the banking sector's resilience against a wider spectrum of potentially large shocks. So, well, we said that it's a buffer that one should activate when risks are neither subdued nor elevated, so a standard risk environment. But a challenge is, okay, what is a standard risk environment? Well, it is a situation where risks are neither excessively high nor excessively low. And one can best identify it as the late recovery period after a downturn or the early expansion phase. And so the picture here shows how the buffer would be intended to be used over the cycle, with well, an early activation happening in a situation where the economy is recovering, banking sector balance sheet are also recovering, And well, overall, banking sector conditions are favorable. Then, well, the build-up can be gradual towards a target rate, and then a further build-up to, say, the peak rate would be envisaged when risks really become elevated. And also challenges happen when to assess how to then release the CCYB while either remaining above the target rate. So, for example, when cyclical risks recede, or releasing the buffer completely when really losses start to materialize, or you have high expectations, the losses start to materialize to allow banks to continue lending. Another challenge that was mentioned by quite some authorities in our workstream is the lack of clarity in the international and EU legal framework. So the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision expressed explicit support for the use of a positive cycle-neutral CCYB in a newsletter they published in October 2022, and they even published in 24 a range of practices in implementing positive neutral CCYB, reviewing the experience of countries that have implemented it. However, this is not yet enshrined formally in the Basel framework, which for some countries constitutes a bit of a challenge. And specifically in the EU, some jurisdictions lamented a lack of clarity in the EU legal framework regarding the possibility to implement a positive CCYB rate when risks are not yet elevated. And that's basically due to different transpositions of European directives in international law. Another challenge that was extensively discussed regarded overlaps with other macroprudential instruments. And this is perhaps a more EU-specific element, as in the EU, we have the systemic risk buffer, whose objective is to prevent and mitigate macroprudential or systemic risks, which are not covered by the CCYB or other buffers, such as the buffer for other systemically important institutions and global systemically important institutions. Conceptually, this kind of vague definition of the systemic risk buffer open the door for using it also for objectives that the CCYB could address, like, well, a positive neutral CCYB would address, namely increasing resilience against exogenous shocks. So, and these actually resulted in several countries calling for more clarity in the definitions of these different instruments that would really disentangle their objectives and therefore avoid overlaps. Finally, many countries discussed the importance of communication. So communication is key not only when you want to introduce a positive neutral CCYB framework, because this helps obviously fostering acceptance by the banking sector and the public, and it also helps steering their expectations regarding the setting of the rate and its intended path over time. But it's also very important when, for example, you would release a CCYB, because then it's key to communicate very clearly what is the timing and intended path of replenishment, because this would encourage banks to actually use the released capital to support lending during a downturn. And otherwise, they would expect maybe the rate to be replenished too early, and then they wouldn't really use the buffers. And actually, many authorities did engage in extremely clear communication, especially through, say, press releases, the financial stability reports, and policy strategy papers. So, well, to conclude, well, the ECB believes that, early CCYB activation is a very valid approach that actually enhances the counter-cyclical properties of the CCYB. Maybe greater consistency in its application across jurisdictions would be beneficial to enhance transparency, predictability, and cross-country comparability, and also improved clarity in the international framework, and EU legislation would really help to clarify the objectives and the design and the release mechanisms, so to really foster a bit more harmonized use, which would also help the banking sector to understand. And finally, clear communication is really an essential element that has to be really taken into account when thinking about introducing a positive neutral CCYB strategy and also throughout the use of the buffer in time. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mara. This was really comprehensive. Thank you very much. I will invite now Angel Estrada. Please, Angel. Angel, being a former Director of Financial Stability Regulation and Resolution in the Banco de España, he has dealt with all kinds of financial stability issues in the country, and also the CCYB. And I suppose that Angel had a key role in implementing this new approach that we've been discussing here, the positive rates for the CCYB in the previous years. So, Angel, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to share with you the change in the framework that we use in order to activate and release the countercyclical capital buffer. That basically moves from a situation in which we only activate the buffer when systemic risks were elevated. When risks were elevated, to other situation in which we activated also the buffer when, as Mara has said, risks are at a standard level. Thank you very much. Thank you. So let me first move to the something I know that I don't know what I have. Sorry. Perhaps here. Thank you. So let me first try to explain you why we decided to change the framework. There were both factors that I think affect to all of us, and also factors that were specific of Spain. The common factors, the COVID pandemic. We arrived to the COVID pandemic without no macroprudential space, with the countercyclical capital buffer in zero, basically because we didn't observe at the Spanish economy, the Spanish banking sector, this accumulation of systemic risk. But the thing is that the COVID arrived, and one tool that could be used in order to mitigate the impact of the COVID, yes, a mitigation, not a very hard mitigation, but a mitigation of the COVID was not there. We also have a lot of empirical research in this period with some countries that have activated the countercyclical capital buffer and released the countercyclical capital buffer. And it's very clear that activating the countercyclical capital buffer has some costs, and it has a lot of benefits when you release the buffer. So the idea is to minimize the cost and maximize the benefits. So one thing that you can do in order to minimize the cost is activating the buffer, as Mara has said, in early times in order to have time enough in order to charge the buffer and share the cost in different periods. And the other idea was that supranational organizations were advising to use this tool. For example, in the European case, the ESRB, that is a macroprudential policy organization, they were advising to use this tool, and also the IMF was also supporting this tool. Specific elements of the Spanish economy were basically Spanish economy, the Spanish banking sector suffered a lot during the global financial crisis. They accumulated a lot of non-performing loans, foreclosed assets in the balance sheet. So it was considered at that time a priority to make a cleaning of this balance sheet. And the cleaning, as you know perfectly well, implies a lot of provisions that reduce the benefits. So it was considered at that time by that time that increasing capital requirements could be very harmful for the economy as a whole. So once that this cleaning shift was finished, that was basically after the pandemic, it was time to change our approach and increase the resilience of the banks, basically using the capital now, not the provision. And the second element, a very important element, is the volatility of our business cycle that is very high compared to other countries in Europe, and also the correlation of the business cycle and the financial cycle. So it's important to have tools that help the authorities to stabilize the economies. And this is very important for countries like Spain, where the other macro tools, stabilization tools, for example, monetary policy, is in the hands of the European Central Bank. So it's not designed specifically for Spain, but for the Euro area as a whole. And fiscal policy has some constraints taking into account the level of the debt. So first hurdle that we found when we tried to change the framework was pointed by Mara. The legal hurdle, because in our first level legislation of the European Union, there was a clear statement saying that the buffer can only be activated when there are risks. And a naive interpretation of this statement is that there are only two states of the nature in the world: risk and no risk. So if there are no risks, you cannot activate. But when you combine the financial cycle with the business cycle, it's clear that other possibilities could arise. And one is this situation of a standard cyclical risk. So that was the first interpretation that should be changed in order to activate the buffer. The second element, the very important role that the Basel gap has in the activation of the buffer. Basel gap is basically the credit to the non-financial, the private sector, divided on GDP. The deviation from the trend estimated with a filter. What is the problem with this indicator? Is what you have in the chart. When the pandemic came and the GDP declined substantially, this indicator increases substantially, indicating activation of the buffer, precisely when the economy was in a substantial decline. So the use of the buffer following only this indicator would have been procyclical, not countercyclical. Fortunately, the legislation also allows you to use more indicators. So in the change of, when we change our framework, basically we have to take two decisions. First, how to decide where the economy was, in which phase, in which state of the nature was the economy. And in order to do that, we develop a system, a panel of indicators. These indicators include basically all the elements that we consider that should be taken into account. First, macroeconomic indicators, because the tools should be countercyclical, shouldn't be procyclical, so you need to have this kind of indicators. Macrofinancial, because it's the financial cycle what we are trying to tame. Indicators from the financial markets, because they have very good properties as early warning indicators. And also indicators from the banking sector, because we have also a lot of evidence that says that to minimize the cost of the activation of the buffer, the banks should be when the banks are in a better situation, the cost of the activating the buffer are lower. So it's important to take into account the situation of the banks when you activate the buffer. Second element, and Mara was presenting this also very clear, is very important, the predictability. All these indicators should be reproducible by all the people that is going to suffer the buffers, the banks and all the people. And they should have a very clear evidence or very clear guidance on how the buffer is going to be used. As you can see, the chart is very similar to the chart that has been shown by Mara, and it's very important to communicate to the people that is working in the market how it's going to be used. In our case, we have, let's say, a forward guidance that is dependent on time, but is also depending on the evolution of the data. And the final element, in order to determine, to operationalize all this new framework, is determining the rate that is adequate for the situation of standard cyclical risk. What we did in this case was basically to use the tools that we have in order to do the stress test, but in a different way. Because usually the stress tests are used, you have the actual situation, the current situation of the economy, you define a scenario, let's say a most likely scenario, and then a scenario that is totally stressed, that is dependent on the most likely scenario. In this case, what we did is to reproduce the economy in a situation in which there were not imbalances, there were not accumulation of systemic risk, the situation in which we could say that is a standard cyclical level of risk. And then we shock the economy with different shocks. Shocks, domestic, real, financial, external, and we shock the economy. These shocks have a different intensity in order to have different implications. And we calculated the capital consumption in these different situations. As you can see, we have three kinds of intensities: mild, medium, and severe. And in the end, it was decided by our governing council that the situation that should be covered was the one that is all the shocks affecting the economy and the intensity mild. Why mild? Probably the explanation is because the probability of having a self-correction of the economy in a situation of standard level of risk is reduced. In the end, we decided to put the buffer in 1%. You can see the difference between the 0.4 and the 1%. This is due to the activity that the Spanish banking system has overseas. In Spain, approximately half percent of the activity is overseas. So for a capital consumption of 0.4, we need to put a countercyclical capital buffer at 1%, because the countercyclical capital buffer, this is a little bit technical, but I think it's important to communicate, is an average of the countercyclical capital buffers that all the banks have, depending on where they have their exposition in the different countries. So, and that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. Very crucial insights, and especially this last slide. So, connecting the dots, I will invite Grillan to the floor. Thank you, Grillan. Grillan from the Bank of England. Bank of England, I don't know if you know, but it is one of the forerunners of this idea of positive rates. Willem has an extensive experience dealing with stress testing, and stress testing is one of the main methodologies used to not only to understand resilience, but also to calibrate the buffer. And I think that you also have vivid memories of some disruptive events. He will mention here, for example, Brexit and COVID. And this is very interesting experience that we can assess. Thank you, Grilla. Go ahead.
Thank you. So how do I open so thank you very much. So I'll just say a few words about how we've used our experience of using the positive neutral CCYB. And I think happily it will coincide with a lot of the ideas that Mara and Angel have already outlined. So thank you very much. So just to say, we've been active users of the CCYB since it was first introduced. And you can see this chart here shows the level of the CCYB in the UK, which looks a little bit like the kinds of charts that Mara was showing earlier. And I'll come back and talk about some of the specific moves that we've made in a few minutes. But just to say, really, by using the CCYB in the UK, we're trying to achieve two things. So the first is making sure that the banking system has enough capital to absorb the kinds of losses that it might experience in a severe financial or economic outcome. And the second thing is making sure that the banking system will actually use those buffers when the shocks crystallize. So what we're trying to do is avoid the kind of really costly deleveraging that was seen during the financial crisis. And what we like to say is that if a shock hits, we want banks to be making decisions about who they lend to in terms of households and businesses based on the balance sheets of those households and businesses, and not based on worries they might have about their own balance sheet. So it's set by the Financial Policy Committee, which is a committee within the Bank of England. It's chaired by the Governor, and it has many overlapping members with our Monetary Policy Committee and also our supervisory body as well, all of which are under one roof, which really helps coordination. So in 2019, we increased the neutral rate of the UK CCYB to 2%. And there was really a few things behind this. I think this was probably one of the earlier moves towards 2% in terms of a neutral rate. And there was two parts to the thinking behind this. The first was that evidence showed that in order to be able to absorb the kind of shock that could hit at the impact of a shock that could hit at the top of the financial cycle, the CCYB would have needed to have been between 3.5% and 5%. And that would have meant that there was enough buffers in this banking system to absorb those losses without banks going into their minima. And the second was that looking back at 2007, most indicators didn't really indicate that there was a need to build resilience until quite late on. So this chart is quite complicated, but the yellow swathe shows what most indicators of financial stability were pointing towards. And you can see that most of them didn't really become elevated until late 2004, early 2005. And by that point, it would have been too late for the FPC to gradually raise the CCYB. And if they'd wanted to get to 3.5% or 5%, they would have needed to make some very sharp moves in the CCYB, which wouldn't have been good because it would have had an impact on the supply of credit. So by contrast, with a higher starting neutral rate of the CCYB at 2%, it gives the committee more chance of being able to increase the CCYB rate gradually as risks build and be able to get to where it needs to be to absorb the kind of impact of shocks that could hit at the top of the financial cycle. So we increased the rate to 2% in 2019, and that had two real benefits. The first is it gave banks more releasable capital buffers to be able to absorb losses without reducing lending. And the second is that, as I said, it facilitates a gradual approach to raising the CCYB as the cycle becomes elevated. And we've really tried to communicate that we will take a gradual and predictable approach to increasing the CCYB, because that has less impact in terms of the day-to-day lending. The other important feature of this was when we did increase the neutral rate from 1% to 2%, we didn't want to change the total amount of capital in the banking system or the total amount of loss absorbing requirements. So at the same time that the neutral rate of the CCYB was increased from 1% to 2%, there was an offsetting change made to reduce Pillar 2A requirements, which helped us get over the line with that and reassure the banking system that this wasn't a way of increasing the structural amount of capital in the system. So just to say a bit more about how we've used the CCYB rate actively, and in particular when we've released it. So we've released the CCYB on 2 occasions. The first is just here in 2016. You can see we just managed to increase the CCYB to 0.5% and had announced it was going to go to 1%. But then the UK voted to leave the EU, which was a little bit of a surprise. I'm Irish, by the way, so for me it was quite a big shock. Although I did go on to lead the Brexit division in the bank, which my wife never forgave me for. But we reduced the CCYB then back to 0, and the narrative we gave was that in times of uncertainty, we wanted to make sure that banks had the confidence to continue lending to creditworthy businesses and households. But then later, about a year or so later, it was clear that the risk environment hadn't deteriorated as much as we had expected or as much as we had feared. And so in 2017, the committee was of the view that the risk environment had returned to standard, and so it increased the CCYB back to its neutral rate of 1% over the course of 2017 and 2018. Then there was that increase to 2% in 2019, which I just talked you through. And again, we had just managed to get there when the COVID pandemic hit, and immediately the FPC was able to reduce the CCYB to 0%. And again, that really helped in terms of sending a strong narrative that the banking system would have the capacity to continue to support lending to households and businesses through the COVID pandemic. And that pandemic release gave us a really nice example to be able to study about the impact of the CCYB. And there's been lots of research done on this. I've just quoted the study that was done by some Bank of England staff here, but I know that there was work done by the BIS and also work on the EU and Hong Kong experiences as well. But the key finding was that releasing the buffers at the start of the pandemic showed that banks who benefited more from that cut in the CCYB maintained higher lending and lower loan prices. And they also continued more lending to riskier borrowers. And this is a really, really key finding for us, because that's exactly what we're trying to achieve through macroprudential policy. Going back to what I said at the start, we want banks to continue lending to creditworthy households and businesses through a downturn and avoid the kind of reduction in credit supply that was seen in 2007-8. And then just the last thing I'd say is that the banking system has really been positive about the benefits of releasability. So they feel that releasable buffers are just more usable than non-releasable buffers. And one of the things they talk to us a lot about is maximum distributable MDAs, which are trigger points at which, when their capital falls, they're restricted on the amount that they can distribute through profits and dividends and that kind of thing. And by reducing the CCYB rate, it reduces the level of capital at which those things are triggered. And they're very important for the banks themselves, because they're important for their shareholders and that kind of thing. So that's one of the things that they've been very positive about in terms of the CCYB and the FPC's use of it. And I think the fact that the FPC has released it on 2 occasions has really helped reinforce credibility that this isn't just a one-way street that's going to be used to build capital. It will be released when it needs to be as well. And then, yeah, just a final word, which goes back to some of the points that Mara and Angel made about the importance of communication. So because we've been using it for 10 or more years now, we've got a well-established framework for using the CCYB. We've got a policy statement which we updated a few years ago on our website, that outlines the kinds of things that the FPC take into account when they're setting the CCYB, some of the conditions under which they might cut it and some of the conditions under which they might raise it to above neutral as well. And there's a two-step process that we follow. So very similar actually to what Angel was outlining for Spain. We assess the level of financial vulnerabilities and take a view on where we are in the financial cycle. And then we assess the ability of the banking system to withstand shocks without needing to resort to an unwarranted reduction in lending to households and businesses. And I think this is one slight difference. We look at it, we don't have a single indicator or a single mechanical thing that we look at. So we look at a wide range. We look at macro indicators across the financial cycle. We look at trends in lending and how that compares to how the economic outlook is evolving. And we use intelligence from banks and businesses as well as to what their experience is. We do also use the stress test. That is a really important input. And we also tend to vary the severity of our stress test. So at the top of the financial cycle, we'll have a more severe scenario, and then we'll look and see what the results imply about the amount of capital that the banking system needs to have. And then lastly, just to say, we do try and respond to some of the feedback that we get from the banking sector. And two things that we're taking forward as part of our capital review that are relevant is, one is how to enhance the usability of regulatory buffers more generally. So I mentioned earlier that the banks talk a lot about impediments to using other capital buffers, such as the CCOB or the systemic buffers. And two things that they raise there are that those buffers aren't releasable, so they would prefer if they were, more like the CCYB and the MDA point that I mentioned earlier. And then the last thing that we get a lot of feedback from our banking sector is about the interaction of the CCYB with other requirements that are also calibrated on domestic exposures. So they raise the point that both the CCYB and our domestic systemic buffer and also credit concentration risk requirement are all calibrated on the level of domestic exposures. So they've asked us to look and see if there's any overlap there, which we're doing. But all that to say that I think I guess I'd sum up by saying that the UK's experience of having a positive neutral CCYB rate has been really positive, and we've really felt that it's really helped enhance our macroprudential framework and help ensure that the banking system can support the real economy through bad times as well as good. And a lot of the things that we've already talked about, such as being really transparent about how we use it and responding to feedback as well, have been really important for trying to enhance the credibility. So that's it. And then I think the one thing I'd just also mention is we did a lot of research, which I haven't listed here, but over the years, there's been some really productive research done. So I'm happy to send on a few links to papers and things that have been done by Bank of England staff, but I think there's probably a lot more that can be done on that as well. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very inspiring. So now, Jon, thank you for being here. I will invite you to the floor. Thank you, Mikio. Jon, he's from the Swedish Financial Supervisory Authority, which shares responsibility with the Risk Bank for macroprudential monitoring and also the CCYB setting. Jon faced the challenge of do you want my help? We'll stop a bit.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Thank you. I would just say that you have extensive experience dealing in a highly open economy like Sweden, and also an active user of the CCYB as a macroprudential tool. So thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So actually, I've only lived in Sweden for 2 years now, and been in this role for 2 years. But prior to that, I actually, during the initiating phase of countercyclical buffers, I was directing the deputy director of the Financial Supervisory Authority in Iceland, an even more remote country, but also in the European family. But very similar experiences of when we introduced this in the first place. Now we've had some very excellent contributions so far. So I will try to be as a little repetitive as possible, but of course it's a little bit dangerous. I thought I would start. The value of my speaking here, it would be to give you like the story of Sweden and how that really fits into all of this. This picture is basically fraudulent on the basis that we are calculating the buffer guide retroactively. This, of course, was not even an idea in the early 90s that this picture goes back to, but I wanted to illustrate that Sweden is a country that has experienced quite significant financial crisis episodes over the years. Of course, the great financial crisis, everybody knows. In fact, Sweden was mildly affected by that, by most standards. And that really affected how Sweden then started developing the countercyclical buffer before that. But in the early 90s, Sweden had a very serious financial crisis with several banks being rescued by authorities. So definitely, there's no hope that Sweden has found a cure for financial crisis. But there's also another point of bringing out this picture of basically the credit gap and the buffer guide provided by the Basel Accord, in that while it is quite indicative at times, in other times it really does not really suggest that this buffer should be used. And if you look at the end of the figure, that is basically the period that we are talking about. So, but we can think about. So this is a picture of how the buffer has been set in Sweden from. So, and the dates refer to the date of the implementation, not the announcement. As in all of these countries, the announcement is usually 1 year in advance when it comes to activating and increasing. So very much from the outset of the new rules on the European level, Sweden started applying this at the 1% level, very much with respect to the let's say traditional metrics that were designed at the outset, but continued gradually increasing the buffer rate for very much up until 2020. But with different arguments as we went along. So while it was the credit growth that was the main argument to start with, other arguments are more prolific or important for the decisions in the later periods. And this has to do with underlying vulnerabilities of the country in question. And in the Swedish case, this is primarily a high level of indebtedness, both for households and in corporates. And also that really housing prices had not slumped as they did in many countries during the great financial crisis. So continued high prices, continued high vulnerabilities, and on top of that, extremely large exposures in the banks towards these particular vulnerabilities related to real estate. So more than 2/3 of all exposures of banks are real estate in some sense or another. So the banking sector is particularly vulnerable. And this is, of course, a key reason why this was early applied in Sweden. So another chapter in the story has already been mentioned during the COVID pandemic. Europe as a whole applied this option of releasing the buffer, and a few countries had made as big a splash in this as Sweden, as it had been able to raise the buffer up to 2.5% prior to that event. And we can very generally describe that experience as positive. This really gave banks a much better leeway to accommodate a very, very tricky situation at this time. Of course, the main objective was to, let's say, counterbalance the extreme uncertainty that was in place at the time. It was definitely a preemptive move, because even though the risk was that that credit quality would deteriorate dramatically and we would have more losses in the banks, this was, of course, done based on the expectations that might take place. And let's move on to the third phase, which is then the topic at hand, which is the positive neutral. Now, and as I have explained, the early adoption of the buffer, it's really has changed character over time, from being a very formal output gap oriented to, let's say, a more holistic view of what are the vulnerabilities at hand. And we can, in some ways, say that this idea of positive neutral had already started in an informal way in Sweden before the pandemic. But it was formalized after the pandemic, very well communicated. I really support that emphasis from my fellow speakers. And then the buffer was raised in two steps from 1% to 2%. Very much at a speed that was fitting for the situation in the banks. Of course, losses were not as severe as were feared, and the headroom in the banking system was quite significant to actually accommodate this increase. This did not have any serious impact on the ability of banks to keep lending. So the main arguments that were put forward in Sweden, very carefully communicated, for having a positive neutral capital buffer, were that the ability to be able to release capital buffers in a future event is most important. And of course, we have the lesson of COVID to really support that fact. But also because economic stress, financial stress is very hard to predict. And if you are able to come up with a model that is very good in defining when a financial crisis is likely to hit, chances are that you are basing your estimates on data that is quite old. And you will almost in all instances only be able to very, very carefully and let's say granularly calibrate the buffer rate, except way too late. But perhaps when the whole event has been over. And so now Sweden has this level of 2% as kind of what we would call a normal rate, when there's neither elevated risk in the financial system, nor is there any let's say crisis ongoing. I'll skip for time's sake very quickly over this. I just wanted to make one point about the methodology, about how this is calibrated. And my main message is that this is not a symmetric process. There are quite different considerations to make when you are on the build-up of the cycle than when you are considering to release it. So in our methodology, we have, like, let's say, two sets of indicators that are, and you can even argue that there should be more, because releasing from different levels, whether you have reached the positive neutral or not, is also a consideration. I want to make one additional point that is may not seem that related to positive neutral, but it is really in the end, and that is the usability of buffers. It has been raised before, but this is become a quite complicated issue worldwide, but I would say particularly in Europe, where the implementation Basel III is a bit evolved. So we have done an analysis on our particular banks in Sweden. And what this picture on the left tells you is well, the yellow lines would indicate what individual banks would have as headroom, simply looking at their CET1 or common equity numbers. But if you take into consideration that there are other restrictions also applying, they may be from the liquidity, the leverage ratio. They might also be from rating agencies, other types of concerns. And also, most importantly, in our case, the resolution recovery system. So there are certain requirements set forward. So banks, let's say significantly large banks, can be resolved in a cost-effective and in a smooth way. And these requirements are often more binding than the actual capital buffers. So the maximum distributable amount, I made it, may not be sort of the relevant issue here. There's also a concern with that way forward that has already been raised. It can contain a stigma effect to it. The experience that we have, at least, is that with the countercyclical buffer, its release was highly appreciated and used in the intended way, albeit with of course, an added, let's say, recommendation to limit all kinds of distributions from banks during a particular period, because of course, the way it turns out, that could have been the result. So on the right-hand side of the picture, we see at least one of these banks that is really, you can see what kind of restrictions are the binding restrictions in case of any losses occurring. And they are, as you can see a little bit all over the place, which is a concern. But in that, having a positive neutral countercyclical capital buffer is really a plus, because that is the most releasable buffer you can say. It's something that has already accepted as something that banks can use in times of trouble, and just do not really affect their trustworthiness, the views of rating agencies, the view of their bondholders, etc. So that is basically my main message that I wanted to convey here. That we don't look at this as symmetrical. It's asymmetric, and it's very important that you have usable buffers that can really be applied in times of crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your presentations. Thank you, the panelists. And I think this helped bring everyone to the same page. Maybe not everyone here has deep contact with the capital framework and the countercyclical buffer. So this also raised very interesting reflections and questions. So I will go straight to one first question in the benefit of time, and then I'll move to the audience to additional questions. And a key feature that I see in all of your presentations refer to the accumulating the capital, the releasable portion of capital in normal times, in standard risk environment, and also in a gradual manner. And this, for me, I saw some graphs there, and a common rationale for that, as I was researching about, is that it is less costly for banks to raise capital in good times, in benign macrofinancial conditions, and compared to having to increase fastly or to not having buffers accumulated when the shocks arrives. And a question that comes to my mind is, okay, but what information indicators, I know that you mentioned some, but what additional indicators to inform our decision-making process, our analysis, that could, considering this argument of having a cost-benefit assessment in good times, what kind of indicators, what kind of information, or how should we define this standard risk environment? It is for you all. I don't know who wants to start, but who wants to react first? Is it tough? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Fernando. Can you hear me? Okay, this is a very relevant question, of course. It's about, okay, when is the right timing to introduce, to start building up early in the cycle, and then, well, obviously timing has a very high relevance, because if you choose to build it up too early, then maybe the economy and the banking sector haven't really fully recovered from a downturn, and then you really risk being pro-cyclical and constraining that recovery. So, I mean, in our experience, what is useful to look at are both macroeconomic indicators, like to have an idea of how your recovery is, well, your economy is recovering from a downturn, but also the conditions in the banking sector, and most, well, the two most relevant that have emerged also in academic studies that colleagues at the ECB have done are profitability and capital headroom, because a profitable banking sector means that if you increase requirements, then they can easily meet them with return or earnings, and that's obviously less costly. Yeah. And capital headroom, like meaning the headroom, well, the voluntary buffers they hold on top of requirements. Then, if there are ample, it means that they can easily convert those management buffers into requirements without needing to issue new expensive equity.
We are changing the nature from management capital to release.
Exactly. Basically, what they have, they just lock in into a buffer without needing to raising new expensive equity, and that also means that the impact of lending will be much reduced or even nil. I mean, the experience we have had in the euro area is that well, several countries have introduced a positive neutral rate framework, or say simply increase buffers, even when monetary policy was tightening. So in the tightening period that has started in 22, basically in the space of 1 year, the ECB's marginal refinancing rate rose from 0 to 4%, which is quite a lot. But in that very same period, many countries, I think 6, if I remember correctly, did increase their CCYB. And the reason they could do that without being pro-cyclical was the banking sector was exceptionally profitable due to the higher interest rate, and they already held quite some voluntary buffers. So then, these are essential conditions.
Thanks.
No, I basically agree with what has been said. I think it's very important to distinguish in the different states of the nature way. For example, when you are in a standard level of risk, macro variables and banking variables, I think that are the most important. We have empirical evidence showing that when the situation of the bank is good, the costs of increasing buffers are very reduced. Also, when the output gap, defined as you want, is positive, the situation is also the costs are also reduced. But when you are in a situation in which you are accumulating systemic risk, I think that the financial variables, credit, the traditional ones, dominate. Yeah, absolutely. And in those cases, probably if you are accumulating, your credit is increasing by 20%, for example, I think that you have to add in any case, independently of this macroeconomic situation and even on the situation of the banks. And then there could happen situation in which you need to act also. For example, increases in the housing prices that are not the result of excessive credit supply, of a relaxation of the credit standards. Those situations, as the reduction in housing prices, the main impact that is going to have on banks is through the macroeconomy, I think that the capital buffers could be also a very good response.
Thank you. So I will open the floor to questions. Please, yeah, thank you. Say your name and your institution and the question.
Hi, everyone. Douglas Araújo here from the Banco Central do Brasil. And before I even ask my question, just had to say, wow, what a great panel. Thank you all so much for all these great insights. My hand almost hurts of how many notes I took. So really useful insights. And, so really, I think you put very well and you highlight a number of times in your presentation that a major goal of the positive neutral CCYB is to allow banks to preserve the capability of supply credit to the real economy, other financial services to the real economy when a major shock hits. And regardless, of course, whether the shock is financial or not financial, as COVID was. But for countries like Brazil and other countries which have a 0% CCYB, one concern that I hear from some market participants, from some commentators, is that the liftoff from zero to an eventual positive target or to a positive rate, the implementation itself, the liftoff, could unduly constrain credit supply in normal times. So I would love to hear from people and panelists, what were your experiences from this implementation period? If you look back, how was credit supply responding, and how did that relate to industry's ex-ante expectations? When it was first being discussed. Did it correspond to their worst fears, or did it, or was it not as constrained in reality when it actually took off from zero to a positive rate? This would be very helpful for us to consider as well. Thank you all so much.
One more.
Hi, I'm Francisco, also from the Central Bank of Brazil. I have a question for anyone in the panel whom I want to share with us. And that is regarding the eventual need or convenience of coordination or adaptation of the calibration of rates across jurisdictions, considering the possibility of arbitrage for capital requirements, across jurisdictions, considering the international banks, considering that some multinational banks might move the capital structure within the group, and should that possibility be taken into account when the financial supervisor is calibrating its neutral rate? Thank you.
One more. Okay.
Yeah, so very interesting panel. My question is more about the release phase that we did, that was not so much emphasized during the panel. So I was wondering, in your institutions, how moving from a neutral to a positive neutral, a countercyclical buffer from the 0 to some positive number has affected or at least interacted with the discussions about rules on restrictions of payments of dividends during the release phase. How these two issues have interacted in your institutions. There seems to be an academic debate about the pros and cons of the restriction of payments of dividends in a provoking sense, recent discussion. So I wonder how this has fed up into your institutions. Thank you.
I can start. Very good questions. I will not be able to answer them completely, so that's good. We have a good panel here. So first about supply of credit during a shock. I agree. It's the fundamental reason for why this is in place. The risk of deepening financial crisis because of banks being very restrictive in their lending. And exacerbating the effects on the real economy. It's really let's say a key thing. Now, when it comes to the way to get there, what you call the liftoff, this has been a key consideration. It was also mentioned here earlier that whether it is in the old style or moving to a positive neutral rate. I agree with Mara that the key consideration is that banks are profitable and the headroom is there. There are other indicators that you might want to look at as well. For instance, how NPLs are, etc. How the price of risk is and asset price levels. But definitely, and this is also really very much related to the third question. When you want to build up a positive neutral rate, at least, you want to do this in a cost-effective way for the whole system, and it so happened to be possible in the case I described, in some other cases, due to the let's say the headroom that was left from the crisis, because the crisis was not as serious for NPLs as initially considered. Now, regarding the jurisdiction issue, and this is a case that is very familiar to Sweden, which is a Nordic country with a lot of interaction with neighboring banks from Norway and Finland and Denmark. So like 2 out of 5 major banks operating are foreign banks. So this is a key issue, how these capital buffers are set. This is what is in the European lingo called reciprocity. So there's a system where you want the capital buffers to apply to exposures, irrespective of their sort of where the sort of lender is coming from, but where the risk is located. And this is sometimes quite hard. And this is particularly difficult when it comes to the infamous systemic risk buffer, which is a complete European invention. And we've had episodes, particularly between Norway and Finland. And I don't want to go into details here, but where authorities have not agreed on the interpretation of what risks are covered by a particular buffer, thereby led to inconsistencies in the application of that. But the positive here is that the counter-cyclical capital buffer, in most cases, alleviates that. So this is another very hard word. Reciprocation is quite automatic. So at least if you don't reach a level of over 2.5%, and that no one has done that before. They are of course, and I don't know if we will ever see that high levels. So this I can surely say is a reason why some countries have chosen that buffer rather than the systemic risk buffer in some occasions. And I assume a similar system would apply to this region.
Can I just add on the question about raising the CCYB for the first time? So I think in 2015, the increase in the CCYB to 0.5% was really part of the post-financial crisis capital rebuild. So it's difficult to pick out what the specific impact of that was. But our experience generally was very similar to what other panelists have said, whereby the academic research that we've done finds that if you increase the CCYB during times when banks are profitable and in normal times, it's much less costly and it has very little impact on lending. And that's also consistent with other findings where we've found that raising the CCYB in general has little impact on the level of lending when it's done in normal times and can be met through retained earnings. In 2021, it was a bit different because the banks had the headroom, so that the effect of the COVID pandemic hadn't been as bad as people feared. So banks still had a lot of headroom that they were able to use, and at that point, we were able to raise the CCYB relatively quickly back to its 2%, and it had very little impact on the supply of credit. And I think I think currently as well, we sometimes hear from banks, they complain that the level of the CCYB in the UK is higher than other jurisdictions. We have two things to say to them there. The first is that we need to remind them that we reduce the Pillar 2A component of the capital stack at the same time. But secondly, then when we look at the amount of lending that's going on in the UK and the profitability of the UK banking system, it sort of doesn't ring true with them being constrained by capital. So we kind of make sure we do an independent check. And then just on the payouts question, just to pick up on that one, I think there's probably three elements. So first is if we reduce the CCYB, the intention is that it's that capital can be used to support lending if banks incur losses. So we wouldn't want, intuitively, you wouldn't want banks to just pay all that out and reduce their capital through distributions to shareholders, etc. So it sort of makes sense that you wouldn't want them to increase dividends beyond what they would ordinarily be doing. But there's still scope within that for them to pay out dividends and to pay bonuses, etc., so long as it's not eating into their capital buffer. I think then there's a separate tool about whether you want to completely restrict dividends and set them to zero, which I think of personally as just a different step that you might want to take, which is that bit more extreme than just simply saying don't increase your dividends. And then just to come back to the MDAs, I think even putting those two things aside, there is a benefit for banks in that it's kind of a technical thing, but if they were to go into their combined buffer, they wouldn't be able to pay out the coupons on their AT1, which is a instrument they have issued. And just releasing the CCYB allows them to continue doing that, which is something that they find very helpful.
Yes, if I may complement to what Wellen just said regarding dividend restrictions. Well, when the pandemic hit, then the ECB actually recommended banks not to distribute dividends. Like there was a big prudential relief accompanied with a recommendation not to distribute dividends, and there was actually a paper assessing the impact of that policy on lending, and the paper found a positive impact on lending, specifically to the economic sectors that were mostly hit by the pandemic. So I think this actually shows that, well, it's an effective policy to combine with a relief to ensure that really credit goes to the real economy and money does not go to the pockets of investors, which is not really the primary objective of a capital release. And then, well, there was a question regarding coordination across jurisdictions. The CCYB has a mandatory reciprocity until 2.5%. So until that rate, there's automatic reciprocity. So a level playing field is guaranteed. If the question is, should a positive neutral rate be reciprocated? Well, we have analyzed that question in the context of this European workstream, and the answer was yes, simply because we're not dealing with a new instrument, it's the same instrument, so the same rules that apply to, say, a regular use of the CCYB would apply to its early activation. So, just to clarify that, well, we're really talking about one instrument, and the same design rules apply no matter whether you choose to activate it early or you use a more traditional approach.
Just to finish, I know everybody wants to have lunch. So thank you very much for your contributions here. Today's debate shows that the CCYB role is evolving, how it is evolving, and for me, it's a paradigm from passively react to visible cara crachá vulnerabilities to a new approach, which is the same instrument, but a new approach where we are concerned about progressively building resilience over time in a cost-effective way in order to deal with increasingly shock-prone world nowadays. And one additional thing is I think it's a powerful insight to have to understand, and this is food for research, I think, that the cost of building capital is scenario dependent. For me, it's very interesting, and how to investigate this issue and to understand this. And there is this insight for me that the dynamic capital can be a cost-effective way of dealing with financial stability issues, and it is gaining a more importance nowadays and in the future. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you all.
Bom, antes do intervalo para o almoço, teremos a premiação, uma breve premiação de 2 trabalhos aqui. Thank you to our speakers. You may now return to your seats. Daremos início agora à sessão de premiação dos melhores trabalhos de discussão do Banco Central do Brasil. É uma iniciativa que promove e divulga a pesquisa desenvolvida pela instituição. Essa premiação é concedida desde 2016, com o objetivo de estimular a participação dos servidores em pesquisas, reconhecendo a qualidade dos trabalhos. Os artigos são avaliados por pares, tanto do Banco Central quanto da academia, no sistema duplo cego. Passam por 2 estágios de avaliação, um que seleciona os 3 melhores e outro que indica o vencedor. As opiniões expressas nos trabalhos são de responsabilidade dos autores, não necessariamente refletem a opinião do Banco Central do Brasil. Todos os textos publicados, em português ou em inglês, podem ser consultados em área dedicada ao tema no site do Banco Central. Essas premiações elas são concedidas em 2 categorias. A primeira é economia e a segunda é finanças e economia bancária. Então vamos aos prêmios, né? E para entregar os certificados eu convido o diretor de Política Econômica e de Assuntos Internacionais e Gestão de Riscos Corporativos do Banco Central, o senhor Paulo Piketty. Para receber o prêmio pelo artigo Liquidity or Wealth, Consumption, Debt and Financial Fragility After a Windfall, da categoria de Economia, convidamos Carlos Carvalho, professor da PUC do Rio de Janeiro e chefe de pesquisa da Capitalo. Para receber o prêmio pelo artigo Consumer Loans, Heterogeneous Interest Rates and Inequality, da categoria de Finanças e Economia Bancária, convidamos Fernando Schertmann, auditor do Departamento de Estudos e Pesquisas do Banco Central, e a senhora Amanda Fantinatti, professora da Faculdade de Economia da Universidade de São Paulo. Um breve aviso de que retornaremos às 13h45. As sessões acadêmicas de macroeconomia vão acontecer neste auditório e as sessões de microeconomia no auditório em frente. Até o momento, as sessões foram transmitidas ao vivo pelo canal do YouTube e as sessões da tarde serão gravadas. Bom apetite a todos.